didn't Canada have a Salem-esque witch trial? Was it because 17th century Canadians were just nicer than Americans? No. Were the early French colonies just somehow above the fear of witchcraft in their midst? No. As always in history, it is much more complicated than that. But what was the early Canadian response to witchcraft and demonic possession like? What did the people living in the very isolated colony of New France actually believe about evil in their midst? This book, The Possession of Barbe Hallay by Mairi Cowan, has some answers to that. My name is Joanna, I'm an historian, and this is a history book I think you'll love. Now, first, I need to apologize to all of my Francophone viewers. Well, I technically studied French, let's be honest. My accent is horrible, and I'm probably going to get some of these French words wrong, and I'm really, really sorry. I blame the government. My main idea for this channel is about convincing people who haven't really dipped their toes into history nonfiction to try out some fun options. As part of that, I've tried to think about what really hooks people in. And for that, part of what I think works for popular histories is having someone to tie the story to, someone to root for and to want good things for. Good examples of this are biographies for specific people, and one of my favorites is called Lady Franklin's Revenge by Ken McGugan, which focuses on Jane, Lady Franklin, as a way of understanding the Arctic disaster that was the search for the Northwest Passage. Following one individual through their life and seeing how history shaped them can be fascinating. But what about the much smaller stories? Lady Jane Franklin is a wealthy woman who was married to somebody who was extremely famous and then died, right? That's a story with a lot of records, a lot of sort of places to go. But you probably have never heard of Barbe Hallay, and I certainly hadn't. And while I'm fascinated enough by the history of New France that my history degree is in Canadian history and I am teaching a course on New France, it is not exactly a topic that is popping off in like the Ask Historian subreddit, if you know what I mean, and I think you do. So what this microhistory does is suck you in immediately by talking about all the signs and portents that were important enough in 1660s Quebec that people wrote them down in letters and other important documents, like the Jesuits were keeping this big book about everyday events. Not the Jesuit Relations, that was officially published. This was like a diary of the Jesuits, sort of. And they wrote down in this book some of these portents. They saw a comet in the sky. They saw a man made of fire. They saw a canoe made of fire. They saw a crown made of fire. They heard women and children crying out in fear and confusion. And at least some of those people believed that these were the cries of their tormented dead. New France was at war with the Haudenosaunee and would be for a long time. This was a group of about 800 people living literally on the edge of empire, and they believed they were being tormented by witches and magicians. So when Barbe Hallay, young girl, teenager, told people about her experiences of being tormented and possessed by demons, people believed her. And they knew exactly who was the one who was casting spells on her. The man she had rejected as a potential husband, the miller, Daniel Viel. Now, I want to be clear. These are people who very much believe in demonic possession. Everyone knew that Barbe was being tormented, that she saw witches at the foot of her bed, that a demon had entered her at night, and this demon had been specifically sent by Daniel Viel. Priests prayed for her. The nuns at the hospital she spent time at tried to battle the demon. The bishop had Daniel Viel arrested, investigated, and executed, although probably not for witchcraft. We'll get there. Ultimately, an exorcism using the most holy of relics in New France, the bones of one of the martyr Jesuit priests, was performed by an elite woman in the community, not a nun, a secular woman. And that is what cured Barbe of her torments, but not until years after Viel was already dead. Now, a lot of what Cowan does in this book is she uses Barbe's life to really explain a lot of what's different about New France from New England. Quebec was founded in part as a Catholic mission with a goal of converting the Indigenous people very specifically to Catholicism. Salem was in New England, and that was a Protestant community, and that difference matters. New France went as far as to make it illegal to be anything other than Catholic to live there, which means you had some people who converted to live in the colony, which means you had fake converts. Suspicious. So what do we know about our witch? We know Daniel Viol was a former Protestant who had converted so he could live in Quebec. Suspicious. We also know he was a miller, and one of the very many things I learned reading this book was that millers were somehow distrusted in New France. The stuff that millers did, making wheat into flour and corn into cornmeal, it cost money to do that, right? And you're only allowed in New France to use the mill that's in the community in which you live. And so you have to pay whatever that miller says you're going to pay. And the miller is always hired by what I will refer to as the lord of the area. The correct term is seigneur, and the area is called the seigneurie, and I am pronouncing both of those wrong, and my French-Canadian friends and colleagues are physically wincing, and they don't know why. But the millers were hired by this man in charge of the whole area that a peasant lived in, which means they're closer to the seigneur than they are to the people forced to purchase his services. And also, he's running a mill. That's a whole separate skill set than everyone else is getting, right? Like everyone else is like, I'm learning how to cut down trees. I'm learning how to dig holes and plant seeds in them. I'm learning how to make a mill work, and it requires a lot of technology, and also I will not explain it to you. We are not the same, right? So on top of that, the mill is on the top of the hill, right? Because in order for the mill to work, it needs to be able to catch the wind, and the people are living down here near the water just because of the way French settlements were set up. I don't want to get into it right now. But it means your miller is living away from where your typical people are living, and so he is separated from the rest of the settlement. He is not only isolated physically by living on the hill, he's also very different in terms of the type of work he does. He is not really part of the community. Suspicious. And again, Viol's a former Protestant. There are so many reasons for people to think there is something off about that guy. Now, one thing I really like that Cowan does in this book is explain what the French in early Canada knew about witches. And this part was really fascinating to me. I enjoy the history of witchcraft, by which I mean I like going on walking tours in various countries. If you are curious, the best ones are on the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. And those stories, which are designed to scare you and then make you buy alcohol, are probably not terribly accurate. Witchcraft was part of a core set of beliefs, and those beliefs were different in different places in different times. The whole thing historians are constantly doing is context matters. That's what we do, right? So belief in witches and their ability to influence others starts to decline much earlier in, France, the country, than it does in New France. And again, a lot of that has to do with the fact that New France is on the edge of empire. If your only way of communicating with home, with the only thing you think of as civilization, is through ocean vessels that get frozen out for 4 to 6 months of the year, you're gonna feel really anxious and isolated. People living in early Canada were also in a constant state of war against the Haudenosaunee, but also, very frankly, against a rugged and terrible environment. I love Canada. I grew up here, but I've also lived in France. These are not environments that have a lot in common. And so here you have a group of people who are living along the St. Lawrence who are like, we're going to try and tame this wild wilderness to grow the same types of crops we grow in Bordeaux. Yes, that makes sense. It's very difficult to survive what people are trying to survive. You are not sure if your family will live through the day because you are in an actual war. It is scary. It is anxious. Of course, witches are cursing the colony. Individual colonists are getting cursed by their enemies. This makes sense. Part of what this book explains is what people knew was true about witches. And what they knew was, first, that witches hated humanity and society. that they target people they knew for their witchcraft and demonic possessions, that magic was the way they chose to deal with rivals or enemies, and that they got their power through birth or initiation. You're either born a witch or choose to become from. But what also you get is that you can force witches to stop their spells, and you can legally prosecute them for their crimes. So for the people living in Quebec, Daniel Viol being a witch made sense. He's a suspicious person. He's a former Protestant. He's a weirdo miller. He knew Barbe and had a really great reason to want to curse her and send demons to torment her. She refused to marry him. And this was at a time when women's role in New France was to get married young and start popping out those babies. We have a colony that we need to make filled with people. How could she choose not to marry him? This is a perfectly rational reason why a witch, suspicious man, would curse a woman. How could she not marry him? It makes sense. And that is a person that the powers that be in New France could charge and punish. So obviously, Daniel Viol was charged with witchcraft, had a trial, and was executed, and Barbe's torments ended, right? No. And the whole next part I'm going to talk about really upset some of my students last week in class because, and this is my favorite thing about history, the thing that makes everything we do as historians so interesting, the statement that seems so interesting when you come across it in a reading: sources differ. I love it. Oh, history is so cool. Come join me. So what did the sources differ on? First, our sources disagree on why Daniel Viol was actually executed. Was it for illegal training of alcohol? Maybe. That's what one of the sources said, sort of. Was it for blasphemy, for lying about his conversion from Protestantism? Maybe. It's not really clear. That's in a different source. And how was he executed? You'd think people would write this down, but there are multiple sources that were written right around when this all happened, and they do not agree on whether or not he was hanged or shot. I mean, he was dead. It doesn't really matter, but my students got really into speculating on how both of those could possibly be true. Maybe he was hanged, but he wasn't dying fast enough, so they shot him. Maybe they didn't want to confess to having shot him because they thought that was a bad idea, so they said that he was hanged, but then somebody came along and editing it. There must be a reason why the sources don't agree on any of this, and the reason is because people are people. That's what it is. They like the answer that it must be some sort of weird confusion than the actual truth, which is that history and its sources are messy. Yes, one of those sources I'm mentioning is this Jesuit journal, which was this daily record of the goings-on in Quebec kept by the Jesuits. But just like when I write down about my day, they weren't writing it for posterity. They were writing it because that's what you did. No one wrote down what happened to Daniel Viol thinking, I know, this will upset enough of Joanna's students in 400 years that they'll start yelling about how people should have known better and actually written things down properly. Y'all, it was such a good class. I wish you could have been there. Those students are so worth my terrible commute. They are a delight. This is what history is. Historians aren't just sitting in the archives reading old letters and writing down what they said. I mean, I do that. But we're also putting things in context. We're thinking about the audience that the text was meant to have. We're thinking about the biases that are just inherent in certain types of documents. We're explaining what happened in the lives of the people who were writing those documents. Yes, it is 100% true. What I do does look like a research montage. But another chunk of what I do looks like a different type of research montage. It's not just reading documents and telling you what they said, because sources differ, and we've got to figure out what to do with that. Now, we know that Daniel Viol died, but what happened to Barbe? We know a lot about her life, in part because she was demon-possessed, right? There are several reports made about the not an exorcism performed by the wife of the seigneur she worked for. And I call it not an exorcism because obviously exorcisms were not allowed to be performed by women at this point, so it certainly wasn't an exorcism and no one called it that. And the not an exorcism included using this relic from a martyred Jesuit priest, and those records were kept in a lot of places because there was a push to canonize that Jesuit priest as a saint. And so they recorded what Mairi Cowan, who did the not an exorcism, said about it. They wrote it all down because they wanted there to be a canonization begun. And this document is another one of those things I loved talking to my students about, because here's the thing about that document. We hear from Mairi Cowan, who performed the not an exorcism. And we hear from the demon that was eventually thrown out of Barbe's body, and he's very angry about that, and he spends a lot of time shouting about it. But we do not once hear the voice of Barbe Hallay. Everything we know about her, despite her torment being the whole central premise, is what other people said about her and the records the church kept routinely as just being part of a Catholic community. So we know she got married several years later. We know she had children and that she was a godparent to other children. We know she was eventually buried in the churchyard. But she was illiterate, and everything else we know about her is because someone else wrote it down. She is apparently the least important part of her life story. Now, there is a lot more in this book than what I'm talking about here. This is a micro-history that uses the possession to dig into the life of men and women in New France. Cowan explicitly is writing for people who don't have a background in this history, and let's be honest, most people don't. But you can read this book, and it will help you see what's so interesting in the history of early Quebec and really get into the work that historians do and the things we get into that we have very firmly worded, polite arguments about in multiple publications. And that is a big chunk of why I think you will like this book. And also, this is just really well written. It's not trying to be written just for academics. It doesn't try to show off Cowan's understanding of the Laurentian thesis. Historians don't come at me. I know the Laurentian thesis is not relevant here. Cowan doesn't think you need to know who Bishop Laval was and why there's a university named after him. A lot of historians, I love us, but we don't write for a general audience. We're writing for other academics. This is not written that way. I talked in my new Booktubers 2 video that depression had stolen a lot of my ability to read, and grad school taught me not to read every word. I read every word in this, and I finished it in a couple of days. It is a really engaging read. And another thing is, look, I hate to say it, but it matters. This is 157 pages of text. It ends here. We've got a glossary, endnotes, bibliography, index, and I enjoyed this part. I looked up several things in the index after I finished it, but the majority of non-historians aren't going to be diving into her sources that much. It's not a lot of text to commit to reading. If you're like, that sounds interesting, do I have the time? It's 157 pages, and it's a good story. It's got a lot of interesting people. There are rivalries, and not just the one where Vuel is like, marry me or I will send demons to torment you. There's also a lot of... I know world building means something, but this book is makes very clear to you, if you do not have the background, what living in New France would have been like and why people were so anxious about the future and why it made sense to fear witches in Canada after France had moved away from this. I wish I had read this book a year ago, because I would sincerely have made this the center of my New France class this term. I do not like asking students to buy books. It's $30, and I think that's actually worth it. I love this book enough that I was reading it for free through my library's website, and I bought a copy because I did not want to risk not being able to access this when I lose institutional library access. This book is so good. A++. Do recommend. Now, the next video that I want to make, I want to talk about space archaeology. I want to see if I can get the hashtag real archaeology people to pay attention to me by saying space archaeology. If you do the like and subscribe thing, not only will you have the knowledge that you cheered me up during an extremely difficult time in my life, but you can also be the first one to know about the space archaeology book and my absolute obsession with space junk. Okay, that's probably the time to wrap this up. Gentle viewer, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and tell your pets I said hi.